Hey there. Welcome back to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering, the podcast where we bring you honest conversations, practical insights, and the kind of knowledge that helps you do your job better. Or at least we hope so. Please let us know how you feel about things. We'd love to hear from you. But really glad you joined us. So let's talk about software licensing. Not the sexiest topic, but if you've ever had an engineering director bang his fist on your desk demanding more licenses in the middle of a crisis, you know it matters. Paul Empringham of NYBS Consulting has spent his career inside these decisions, and he's here to help you stop overpaying, stay compliant, and actually understand what you're buying. Let's jump in. Welcome back, everybody, to Stay Sharp in Digital Engineering, the podcast about all things digital, from engineering to manufacturing to service and beyond. I am one of your hosts, Julianne Grant, and I am joined today by my co-host, Jonathan Scott.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, good day, Jonathan.
Good to be back.
We are back in the hot seat. And today we've got an interesting conversation. It's a topic we haven't covered before. And we're talking about software licensing in the digital engineering space. So I know it doesn't sound very exciting, but you know, it is pretty interesting. When we started digging into this discussion with our special guest today, who I'm going to introduce, we have Paul Empringham from NYBS Consulting. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
So let me tell you a little bit about our guest, Paul Empringham. He is the VP of CAD Simulation and PLM at NYBS Consulting, where he specializes in engineering software license optimization across CAD, PLM, simulation, and EDA sectors. With a career that spans designer, engineering systems manager, and transformation manager roles, Paul brings a rare hands-on perspective to IT asset management, one shaped by deep experience on both the end user and the enterprise side of the complex manufacturing organizations. So he's worked with some impressive names along the way: JCB, Sunseeker, Rolls-Royce, BAE, Red Bull, and F1. And he's an active industry voice and writes regularly on IT chargebacks, CAD adoption measurement, and engineering software trends. And when he's not optimizing software licenses, we got some interesting fun facts about Paul. He once came face-to-face with a hungry hyena in Botswana and was recently swam with a 9-foot whale shark. Now, you are much braver than I am, but somehow he's still here to talk to us about PLM today. So thanks for joining us, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Hyenas and sharks, two of my nightmares right there. Don't need that in my life. Yeah.
My tip to you is never turn the lights out to look at the Milky Way when when you have a steak in one hand and a hyena hiding in a bush next to you. But hey, I'm here.
We're glad you're here.
Yeah. Wow.
Thank you.
That's something, Paul.
It is.
I can't wait to get back to Red Bull and F1, but you know, the hyena is pretty interesting too.
It is.
All right. So with that, I'm going to jump into the topic at hand.
Yes.
And explain things, a few things then maybe we can go deeper on the ins and outs of software licensing today in the enterprise space. So to start, I just want to level set on why the topic's so important. I think lots of people, probably are thinking, yeah, it is something we have to talk about. But we're playing fast and loose with the term licensing because we want to talk about all the things around that, not just the license itself, right? So how organizations buy, use, and continue to pay for the use of commercial off-the-shelf COTS, right? When we say COTS software, that's what we're talking about. So yes, the license, what the user's allowed to do with the software, that's part of the discussion. But we also want to get into the commercial models around the ongoing use of COTS software, because that's the tricky bit, I think. In the DE space, companies don't often buy software just for a couple of uses for a couple of months, right? It's a much longer term thing. So I want to dig into that a little today, but let me start with a question on some definitions, Paul, just to level set everybody. So what kinds of software licensing models are mostly used today, including maybe a few that could be dying out, but are still common? What do people see?
Okay. It's interesting because I think a lot of the software vendors want you to think of past, present, and the future kind of around these license models. So if we look back at how the CAD software and simulation software developed, back in the day, we had aerospace and automotive customers, and we had generally a CAD package with some drafting, and that was it. And that was with a perpetual license model, it was called. Right. So you bought the license, you then paid maintenance on top, and that gave you the support from the vendor as well. And that was great. It allowed us to work with concurrent licensing. So that allowed us to, let's say you had 300 designers in your team. You could buy 200 licenses, and that gave you the good ratios for use, because there's always going to be some engineers out traveling. There's going to be some engineers on holiday. There's going to be some engineers in meeting. But a pool of 200 licenses would quite happily serve 300 engineers. And occasionally you might get a denial, but that was typically the ratios we went with. And it was a great model that worked for a long, long time.
Yeah, that was sort of the one I remember getting back into the industry back in the day, right? That was kind of the baseline.
Yeah, absolutely. And it worked well for the vendors. Companies could understand it, but it was very much a CapEx expenditure. You paid up front and then you paid a percentage on top. And don't get me wrong, there's still an awful lot of customers doing it in this still space at the moment. And it's, I think we're around 12 to 15% kind of maintenance or kind of increase every year as well with these license costs. But then the software developed. These software tools, quite rightly, became much needed. And so the companies, aerospace, defense, automotive, really pushed the envelope here. But they wanted to start doing more simulation. They wanted to do some electrical routing. They wanted to do sheet metal. They wanted to do CAM. So we found that the big tools from the biggest vendors started pulling in all of these additional functions and features. And that's where they had a problem, where they wanted to charge more for these specialist advanced features. And perpetual licensing was a great base level, but then they added on these different features on top. But the companies discovered that they weren't doing these specialist features throughout the entire project lifecycle. So if you're designing a wing mirror, the electrical aspects of it might only be several weeks, whereas the surfacing aspects of it might be more. So what they changed to do was move into more of a subscription-based licensing.
Okay.
It's a way that many of the vendors could package up and bundle up a number of these different features to create subscription licenses that could be a regular, they pay for monthly or they pay for annually.
That whole recurring revenue thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we all understand why this happened. And this is because it moved from the CapEx to the OpEx. And for these vendors who need to have huge numbers of software engineers, they just wanted to bring that income in on a more regular basis, I think, and be sure about it. Because with perpetual licenses, occasionally some companies said, well, this is all we need. We don't need any more features than this. We're going to stop paying maintenance. And then that's it. The vendors aren't receiving any further income. And then a few years later, the company would say, okay, we want to upgrade. And then they would go and pay a slight penalty. But the companies were probably up. Whereas the vendors needed to change that process. So yes, it was quite a big move to subscription-based licensing. And you find that nowadays, many of the vendors don't even offer perpetual licensing. It is simply subscription. You take it out and you're paying that same price every year. And that gives flexibility. That does give flexibility to companies to shift up and down. They might bring in a number of contractors so they can bring in buy another 50 licenses for a certain period of time and just drop them off at the end. And operationally, that works for them.
Well, and it feels like that was also reinforced by the introduction of SaaS too, right? As SaaS showed up, subscription was really the better way to buy it because you weren't just buying the license, you were also buying the service of the servers behind the scenes and all of that. And now it's like that's almost the default model, it feels like.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're moving that way. I was talking to value-added reseller the other day, and they were saying that in India, 90% of their sales were going on Teamcenter X and NXX. They were on the platform as a service tools. There were very little numbers of companies purchasing for on-premise installed software, which blew me away. I was really, really surprised. But that just shows that, yes, the subscription basis is now also moving to the cloud as well. I mean, that's not it, sadly, so we do subscription licenses. And then with that, there's certain software types. So CAD has a number of different bundles at different levels. But with PLM licenses, we moved very much to a named user. So rather than having this concurrent usage where you'd have a pool of licenses, we moved to a license being required for every user. Now that has created some problems within the industry, and there's been a lot of upset, I guess, because you could handle your occasional users and your viewers with these ratios, but now with a named user, you have to have a license for everybody. With PLM, that's typically okay because we know that it's a lower cost compared to these kind of high-value CAD and simulation tools. But there's been some vendors in the AEC space who have moved license model about 5 times over 15 years, and they've heavily pushed their users into these license models all the way through.
So that complication there is you have to have an associated email address or that person's email address with the license. You can't just do like IT manager and,
well,
IT
yes,
at
absolutely.
or can
Okay. Named user. If you want to stick by your license conditions, your end user agreement, yes, individual users and named users.
And it's tricky. I get it from the, you use the PLM example, and it's probably true of any of the systems that are not just software applications. But I understand, right? You want security and things per person. So you want things done per person. And it's logical for the vendor then to say, well, I can charge per person then instead of with concurrency. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It just sounds a lot more expensive.
I mean, it doesn't have to be more expensive, but, the vendors want more control. And they, for them, it's some great statistics to see who's actually using the software, how, and to guide them in probably what they need to develop moving forward. So, but we are at the stage where we have licenses, subscription, perpetual, kind of on-premise, and now a lot more vendors are beginning to serve their licenses from the cloud. So Dassault, Autodesk, most of the vendors now have an option and they serve that from their cloud servers, which hasn't been great when AWS goes down, let's just say, but let's assume that they'll find some money to build some redundancy into these in the future because they haven't done so far.
Okay.
And that last one's an interesting one. Like we were saying when you mentioned subscription earlier, and I connected that to cloud, is that it starts to can get confusing from a pricing perspective on what you're buying, right? These days, subscription can include the computing usage as well as the software license, and it's hard to unbundle or change or those things. So it's another thing to note as we're talking about types of licenses.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about who buys these licenses. Is it who in the organization are the people who decide the structure and how many to buy and all that?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So most of this software is used by the R&D development teams. So the leader of those teams tends to be an engineering director, head of engineering, or it can be somebody. You bring in a couple of guys or girls who've been using SolidWorks at a different company. They come in, and then that kind of creates this requirement. Well, we need to pull in some SolidWorks licenses. So it tends to be led by engineering teams. And of course, lots of big companies have different engineering teams across different countries and across different product ranges as well. So that's traditionally where the software vendors target. They're targeting the users where the need is, dazzling them with the features. Mm-hmm. It tends to then be an IT decision as to whether you want to purchase the software, because all software tends to come through IT department and CIO, so they tend to have to give a sign-off. And then, of course, it initially goes through purchasing. And for the initial purchase, I think purchasing tend to be the least involved. They get on with it. Maybe some negotiation. But of course, later in the cycle, when it's the renewals annually or after a 3-year deal, procurement, purchasing tend to be far more involved in trying to, well, that's their job, to beat down the price and get the best price. So we have this kind of weird 3-way system for engineering R&D licenses, which probably doesn't happen for other software types like ERP, which is understood by finance, typically for finance, isn't for or Adobe and some of these other tools. So yes, this 3-way triangle can definitely cause some problems, and it can be played by the software vendors as well.
One of the things I've heard from software vendors talking about that, right, and how they navigate through that process is that often those 3 speak different languages, right, in terms of how they work together. And that's the challenge is, right, engineering is like, I need the tool. And, purchasing is like, well, justify it, and they're like, well, I don't speak finance. I can't, so they end up, they can't work together and, it makes software deals fall apart sometimes.
And go back, 5 years or so, it was specialist hardware, computing hardware that was required to do it. You still need some beefy computers if you're doing this stuff on site. If you get into the simulation side of things, then you're going to need some rack space with some massive servers for doing overnight compute. And it's those conversations are typically initiated with engineering, but then they throw it over the wall to the IT team and say, well, just make it happen. We need 600 desktops that can run this software with these specs and these graphic cards. And it's been a massive problem that continues. So,
So I want to pivot to something as we're talking about who's involved in purchasing, right? One of the things that I know has come up a lot in my experience is people wanting to not just beat down the price in that sort of purchase financial negotiation, but say, wait, are we using the right licenses? Do we have what we need, the right thing? So I think the term is license optimization, but can you explain that to us, Paul? What is license optimization? What does that look like inside of a company?
So probably one of the misunderstood things out there, really, and this is what I do, and it's very niche, but software license optimization really, you have to measure. So we have to initially put some tools in place that just measure who's using which licenses on which computers, where in the world, for how long. So we do that, and that just gives us the initial overview of everything they're using. Now, you notice I said they're features because every software now has base usage, modeling, maybe drafting, but then we have all these additional features that sit on top that are utilized. And of course, most of the companies provide that to you in a bundle as well. So for a certain price, they give you all of these features. But of course, you're probably not going to be using all those features. And that's the choice between a bundle at this price and a bundle at this price. And this is where it's very difficult to understand from a cost perspective which bundle to take, to buy initially. So we measure who's using what, where, and when. So we provide this reporting, and we provide that live, and we provide reports afterwards. And that allows us to create, in the software asset management world, something called an effective license position. What you've bought against what you're using. And if you want us to, we can then go into your contract to work out whether you're compliant against what you signed up to in the beginning, which is a whole subject I think we're going to talk about soon, where unwittingly many companies fall foul of their compliance position from the EULA, the end user agreement, and any additional contractual things that have been signed up to. And typically we know managers might stick around for 3 years, 10 years, but maybe somebody negotiated that contract 15 years ago when they first started using it. And there's far too many things written on ink in a contract that no one is aware of or adhering to anymore. So we can get to that stage of understanding where a customer is, what they're doing, are they compliant? The next level then is talking about how do we enhance that? So how do we, if they're on perpetual licenses, how do we improve those ratios? So there's idle time. There's, an engineer might well open up the software. He's consuming the license because it's on screen, but he's gone to a meeting for 2 hours. Is that the best use? Is that efficient? So a lot of the software vendor daemons, the licensing mechanisms, allow you to pause those licenses and give them to someone else during an idle time. So there's something called a timeout or an idle time. So we can track that in real time, and we can give those licenses away to someone else to make it a bit more optimized.
So it's not just about the tracking and sort of figuring out for the next renewal. Some of it's about actively managing.
License optimization can be used for so many things. There's so many kind of intangible benefits, and some that our customers get is identifying users, the key users or the power users in each of these kind of functions. They're really expensive functions. So they see these guys, and next time they're doing an upgrade, simulation, CAD, PLM, they know that those are the people that they need to go and talk to do the UAT testing. It's used to identify adoption gaps or training gaps. You thought that an entire team had sufficient training to use sheet metal design, and suddenly you look at the details and there's 2 people using it and nobody else. So it only ever brings up questions, I'm afraid, because you can look through this data and you can say, "Oh, but I didn't think this was happening," or why aren't those guys doing that, and why is she on this license when we had an options file that stopped us doing that. So yes, it just gives that whole holistic picture of your licensing, and with that information, you can then use it for renewal. And all the other contractual bits that we should be doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find that it gets a little muddy when you're at renewal time and you have a feature or function that you really want, and it's bundled in with something much bigger than you really need.
Yep.
Or, they really just demo to one feature, so you buy the next level, and then it really is not what you need at all. And so you find yourself stuck, and there are several vendors, I'm not going to name names here, but, there's some we deal with all the time, and it gets very frustrating from a user perspective, and not just even from a renewal perspective, but both sides, right?
It's tough. I think the vendors have a tough job because, they're a commercial entity that answer to shareholders. And I think sometimes it's obvious which ones they are because the way they bundle their software, pricing, prerequisites. And then there's others which make it very granular and flexible, and provide a bit more transparency to their users around what they can and can't do. The way of the world, I think, isn't it, with software?
Yeah, so how do you prevent someone from overbuying? Like, are there any tricks or tips you can offer?
Yeah, well, as I said, our engagement typically come from a trigger, and the trigger might be we've got a renewal and the price has gone up substantially, or a CIO saying, new in a department saying, well, how many of these licenses do we actually use? And no one's got a clue. So yeah, it's just identifying the number of licenses you've got, the usage patterns, and the idle time users. But we tend to show that the most popular ones are a graph that show percentage use. How many licenses can you have? So let's say a company does have 300 licenses. We have a graph that shows you to get 95% usage, you could probably get away with 180. And that's causes a lot of discussion. And then from there, I think I'll come back to this later, but if you're aware of your numbers, then it just allows you to discuss, negotiate, and everything in every stage. But the majority of companies out there just don't know what usage they have.
Yeah, it's that sort of information is power in the negotiation concept. And if you just don't have the information, you're sort of, okay, I think I need this, and off you go.
Yep.
Yeah, along with that question, Julian, you were asking about, overbuying. I imagine there are other mistakes people make that they figure out when they do dig into their licenses, when they think about it.
So tell me, Paul, a situation that you've been in that just kind of went sideways, or you just saw kind of a mess of things from licensing.
Yeah, we when I look back at my career, I was an engineering manager, and we had good, really solid ratios for licenses, as you'd expect for somebody in this game. But everybody was in a kind of an all-hands design meeting. The office was a ghost. And then everybody came running back, and they started firing up their software. We had NX, we had SolidWorks, we had a bit of everything, to be honest. And pretty quickly, some heads went up around the office. I wonder what this was. And the engineering director came running out of his office, banged his fist on my desk. "We've run out of licenses. Why haven't we got enough licenses?" And I was, yeah. And when I looked around, everybody was there. Everybody was online. And so as it turns out, he'd basically challenged everybody to get back to their desks. They needed to design something. There was an urgent task. But we simply didn't have the ratios for everybody to have a license at the time. You shouldn't do. If you're optimized a license appropriately, you don't have a license for everybody. He was demanding I buy 8 more licenses at the cost of blah, blah. But no, once I showed him the stats, because I had live monitoring, and I said, just send 5 guys downstairs to the lab, send 2 off to do this, and we won't have a problem. But you could spend a lot more money right now to get these licenses that you simply don't need to have. And I could show him the stats. So once he could see visually, he was happier-ish.
Yeah, so it's like, calm down. Let's look at this.
Yeah, let's look at this properly.
Well, stop making perfect storm events by having an all hands and then requiring everybody to go right back to their desk.
Yeah.
And it happens.
Not me.
And it's these situations where people panic and they buy more licenses that they're never going to use.
Well, that's true.
So
that's true.
Yeah. Stay strong. Engineering directors, engineering managers out there, stay strong. Push back. But have the evidence to show them.
Yeah, have the evidence is really important there.
Yeah.
So, Paul, what other kinds of mistakes do companies typically make related to licensing? I mean, we've talked about a couple, but what do you see out there?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few mistakes. Some mistakes that people do on purpose. Piracy. I have had to go and visit a couple of people when I worked for Siemens. I had to go and visit a couple of companies. Just look at, can I just check on your licenses? And the manager there held his hands up and he said, "Oh, we were waiting too long for our reseller, so I downloaded a pirated or a hacked license and put it on." But of course, what he didn't realize is it actually puts code within the part file that identifies what license it was. And it cost them a lot of money because it had tagged each of the parts that they'd designed. So yeah, he wasn't.
Wow.
His managers weren't very happy. So I've acted as policeman before. So yeah, there's a lot of people out there who
it's
use...
like 60 Minutes coming to the door. No.
Yeah.
It's like, you don't really want to come in.
But yeah, so I think people need to be aware that if you do use student licenses, maker licenses, or illegal hacked licenses, it does tag the models. And then when you try and use them in a corporate environment and you try and load them into someone's PLM system, guess what? You get some strange errors and things, and that's data has to be cleaned at a cost, or it has to be remodeled at a cost. Oof. So yeah, there's that's purposeful, but then non-compliance can happen purely by mistake. And we see a lot of people, as I said, there's a lot of things in contracts that the vendors are fully aware of, and companies just over time forget about. But typically we see geographic boundaries as quite a big one. So you tend to, depending on the vendor, you tend to buy the software in a country and there is a geographic zone you can use it in. So you can't then, let's say you've got a license server in the US, you contractually are not allowed to share your licenses with your team in India. Technically, it's very easy. In the software, you simply move it to the server, give them the server address, and they're off getting the licenses. But contractually, that's bad. And a lot of the vendors do then charge a global license, so that you can do the follow the sun. But that is on a contractual basis. So we see that an awful lot. Geographical side of things. We also see generic logins, and this is what you said earlier.
Yes.
There's a login so if it's a CAD software, they log into the computer as CAD user, but multiple people do that on that computer on and off. So you're not allowed to have generic logins, certainly not for PLM. And we do see that a lot. But we do see admin users being used to pull out data or access data. You're non-compliant. So
that's interesting.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, I've seen so many of those modes that you just talked about, Paul, and the one that I find most challenging, being on the consulting side of it, is when it's just a lack of information that causes some of these things, right?
Yeah.
When I'll see a customer, they want to buy, like you said, PLM and use it globally. And maybe the vendor's license model is such that, the way it works is you buy the licenses for the server where the PLM server is, even though the users are globally.
Yep.
And they think, okay, I'm fine. But they really have to dig into it. And sometimes the reseller or even the vendor themselves, you've got to get to the right person who understands, no, here's the proper way to do it, right?
Yeah.
You need that global uplift, or you need to do this, or whatever it might be. And so it takes a bit of homework sometimes to make sure you've got the right thing, the right scheme for what you're trying to do. And that's tricky. Can be.
And it's sometimes it's purposefully complex as well, because some of the vendors, no names, use non-compliance as a sales tactic. You go in, they install their software, they install like an agent on every computer that goes through and checks on usage, and it checks on installs. And some of the agreements say that you can't have multiple versions installed of the same software. So say you've got a version 2009, 2016, and a 2027 install. Well, then it starts flagging that up and counting some of these licenses, and you're contractually you shouldn't be doing that. And there we are. So then they have a conversation. You can either pay a fine or you can buy more software. So.
Well, just think about mergers and acquisitions, and you acquire a company and you have multiple licenses, and all that consolidation and thought process has to be put into place. Yeah,
I mean, that's another trigger for us, that companies come, maybe they're thinking about an M&A, and they might want to put in a piece of software to understand usage, number of licenses and compliance before they do actually do that. That's happened. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, the one thing the scenario that we've come up against on my team is sometimes we want to customize or build out or support, some software that we have, and you need to bring in a consultant who can have access to a license. Mm-hmm. But then, if you have this name user approach, it creates problems or it makes it a little more complicated. So,
yeah, we have a lot of customers who are interested in understanding the amount of time that their contractors spend on the system. So timesheets go in. I did 40 hours this week on SolidWorks. And they want to look at the stats and see how long were they actually on SolidWorks, or how long were they active on SolidWorks.
Right. That's an interesting aspect.
That's two different things. You can take a license and stand by the water cooler, or you could actually be working on it.
Very good point.
That's an angle I had not thought about. That's fascinating.
Me either.
Okay, Paul, so what are the top couple of things that our audience should know? We've talked about mistakes. We've talked about things people could do to optimize. But what else should people know about software licensing in this space?
I think every company really needs to understand where your vendor's going. What is their plan for the future licensing? And that's typically not revealed, online.
Something you don't usually ask.
That's not something that you can look at their website and see what the plans are. But you need to have a relationship with the vendor, with the VAR, or direct, to understand what they're thinking for the future. We can see, and we'll talk about this, but we can see that perpetual subscription. We're moving towards tokens and consumption and token burn. We're moving towards these things. And I think the future, we live at a point now that things are changing so fast. How we license and think about things now probably won't be that way in 2 years' time. So talk to as many people as you can at your vendor to really understand what their future motion is around licensing. I think I said earlier, don't fall into the sales trap of buying bundles and suites that are too big, too much for what you actually need. Buy a few, work with someone like me to understand your actual usage, look at those bundles, look at the increments and see what's actually in there, and choose the appropriate bundles. The salesmen are very good. I'll sell you 70 of these at this cost. The more you buy, the cheaper it is. But of course, in the long run, it isn't.
You're almost going to hit that tier. So, why don't you buy these 5 licenses?
So it's the biggest mistake that we see companies make, really, is start, as ever, agile, start small and build. Don't always believe the hype. One of the things I haven't touched on, but is the most, has the biggest impact, I think, is negotiating license remix.
Okay.
I can't, I don't have enough fingers and toes to see the number of users out there, customers out there who have licenses they simply do not use. They've purchased, they've forgotten about, the teams have moved on, or their licenses in a bundle or a portfolio that just aren't used. Don't be scared of having a chat with your sales team, with the vendors, to say, look, we're not using these. Can we switch these out for something else? And when I talk to software vendors, they quite often have what they call a frozen account. The engineering director is not willing to pay any more money because he's spending $500,000 a year maintaining this software. The forward-thinking software vendors will work with us to do an engagement to identify what they're using, what they're not using. And if we can see that there's a certain number of licenses they're not using, and they can do a remix deal, so they can trade in a number of those licenses for something else, the latest feature, the latest thing with the bells and whistles, then it almost always happens that account is unfrozen and there's growth in that account in the future. And they now buy the latest tool, they love it, and they buy more the next year. And that account is now back active again, rather than being frozen for the last kind of couple of years. So, yeah.
It's interesting. It clearly benefits both, like you said, Paul, or it can benefit both sides. So many customers I talk to, they never consider the option, right? Like if we bring it up to them, hey, wait, it's been a couple of years. Are you really using that? They're like, you can do that? Yes, you can do that. People don't always think of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just, knowing what's possible. I suppose it's knowing what people have done rather than what's possible, because everything's negotiable. It just needs thinking about and the raw data behind it to see what you're doing and what you're not.
And it comes back to the three-legged stool you mentioned earlier too, right? Because when I do hear it come up, a lot of times it's purchasing that will bring it up, and engineering never would have thought of it, right? They're like, well, I signed a contract 10 years ago, so I have to keep doing that thing. So I'm glad you brought that one up as things for people to think about.
It is tough. We're also in the IT asset management or software asset management world. There's a lot of people that understand Microsoft licenses, Oracle licenses, SAP licenses, and the others. There's not many people who get into these different hybrid models we talked about earlier. Perpetual, license demons, the statistics. And once they have got the log files, how do they read them? So, there's a few companies out there that provide software dedicated to these engineering software tools that provides that kind of immediate view and all of this reporting and dashboard view for it. They're just not widely known enough and not widely used. But yeah, that's really where people need to be looking.
Well, you'd think, in the scenario that you mentioned about when the user or the customer is much more engaged once the remix happens, and they're starting to move forward, or they're moving off the old system, getting to the new releases. It just makes so much more sense from a vendor perspective to want that for your clients, because you want people to stay current because you're putting all this effort and development into the new features. And so, you would hope that there'd be more consideration and goal to help clients get to that level, as opposed to staying stuck. So
I'm not here to bash vendors at all.
No, I'm not either. But I'm on the other side. I mean, I look at it from both sides, right? So
and I think there's definitely a movement to provide a license mechanism, a license model that is better for the end user and is more flexible, and that is the kind of the tokenization side of things, which we need to talk about in more detail, I think, really.
That word sounds, we've heard the word many times, tokenization, but and I've gotten ding dong Claude for mine. So but anyway, on that note, let's move to the summary. I think we're kind of up on our time, Jonathan, but we've had a great conversation, and we've covered a lot of territory here.
I've got one more I want to ask, though, a quick one to Paul. Okay. And we don't normally do this on the episode. We tried to stay out of talking about specific software, but you named something that I think our audience would really benefit from. You mentioned there are a handful of softwares out there that work in the DE and manufacturing, digital engineering manufacturing space around license management and understanding your usage. Could you just name a couple of those so that people know what to look for?
So, it's a niche industry. So there's 4 out there that people can look at. Obviously, you need to talk to me first to understand the best tools, because they're all different for your use cases, really. And depending what real SAM tool you've got, maybe you've got ServiceNow or something, and some of them. OpenLM is probably OpenLM out there. OpenIT, TeamEDA, and Siemens have bought Altair, who also have a product as well. So that's realistically the 4 good cumbersome ones. The ones that do the whole lot.
Gotcha. Good.
Nice.
Sorry, Julianne, you're right. We're out of time, but I wanted to sneak that one in.
No, that was good. That was good. I'm glad we added that in there. Great. All right, so let's move to the summary. Are you prepared?
I think so. I've got a few notes. So, Paul, what I miss and what I forget, please fill in the gaps for me. But I think we talked about license models, right? And the sort of one that everybody recognizes from years gone by is perpetual plus maintenance, where you're buying the software but then paying a fee every year to maintain it. And we started out with concurrence as an option because we were dealing with a lot of applications and CAD and pools of users and things like that. But then moved on to subscription as things got bundled together, and we wanted usage of sort of these feature licenses and that kind of thing. And then as we got into system usage, we also ended up with named user as a model as well. So you couldn't share licenses across people, but you had to identify exactly who was logging in or accessing the system. And cloud has added an element to all of this, right? Where, yes, it's frequently named user because someone is logging in remotely, but you've got this subscription element, but sometimes it bundles in more than the license. So lots of different angles on thinking about how software licensing happens. And we moved on to talking about who's involved. And we talked about a 3-legged stool there, a great analogy that you gave, mentioning you've got your subject matter expert who's wanting the software license, engineering, maybe in other cases it's manufacturing, but it's somebody who's got that specific need in this space. Then you've got IT, right? And the CIO is often going to get involved because they're looking at the overall portfolio and what works with their systems. And purchasing, who's going to help negotiate the pricing. And over time, they can play an even bigger role as you renegotiate over years. We talked a little bit about optimization, right? And how license optimization can happen. And I think the key thing you mentioned was that knowledge is power here as you're thinking about how to use that software over time. So you need to measure your usage. And we talked about some tools here just a few minutes ago that can help you with that. I'll come back to that in a minute. But you want to know how much, from where, when, all those kinds of things about your usage so that you can pick the right bundles and you can have the right conversations. And you can tell a lot of other things from it that you mentioned. It's not just about sort of the commercial optimization, but how do you use your software? Do you have enough training? Are people adopting? Those kinds of things. So we moved on to talking about mistakes that people make. Overbuying was a logical one for us to talk about, but we added a few others that people can run into There's outright intentional things like piracy, right, where people are using, cracked software and things like that. But there's trickier ones where maybe they're using maker versions on a commercial basis and they shouldn't be, that kind of thing. And then there's just non-compliance that can be intentional or unintentional, like using a license outside of the geography in which it was purchased and not realizing maybe that the license tells you can't do that. That happens sometimes with these systems, and you have global teams and you didn't think about who's using it where, that sort of thing. Another one you mentioned that I've certainly seen plenty of people try to skirt by on is this generic login concept. Oh, I just need, 10 different people in the plant to look at that so they'll all share a login on one computer, and you look at the fine print and that's not okay. So we moved lastly to things people should know, right? Out in our audience, what should people be thinking about there? And I think a handful of things you shared. So understand where your vendors are going with licensing, because where they move in the future can matter to how you manage that next renewal with them and what you think about for your mix. Think about the bundles you're buying and be careful with that. Sometimes it works out great. It's exactly what you need. Other times you might overbuy just because it sounds like it's going to help, and that might not be what your real usage is. And don't forget to negotiate a license remix. Look at what you're really using and don't be afraid to ask for something different, because often that's to the benefit of the vendor and the customer. And then lastly, we added in that topic, hey, you should know there are some softwares out there that can help you with the information and the knowledge that you need to be empowered in all these areas of licensing. And the ones you named, OpenLM, OpenIT, Team EDA, and Altair, all are folks that you could look at out in the market that might have the kind of thing that you'd need to get the information you want. That's what I heard. But what did I miss, Paul, in terms of key points we talked about today?
I think you've pretty much summed it up, really.
Okay.
Yeah, it's don't be scared to ask. Understand, get that remix. But yeah, the key that most companies do is they just don't know who is using which software and where. So once you understand your ratios, understand idle usage or not, that's when you can start optimizing. And that's, if you want to save money, that's great. If you want to understand usage across different projects, that's even better.
Well, it's a great way to conclude this conversation. Yeah. So thank you so much, Paul. This has been a great conversation.
Yes,
appreciate
you,
your joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's great. And thanks, Jonathan, for that great summary, as always. So I want to thank our listeners for joining us today. I hope you found this interesting and enlightening and got a few nuggets for your next time you're renegotiating some licenses or looking to buy software and have a better understanding of what you should be doing. I certainly do. So thanks to this conversation and Paul Empringham and his wise counsel for us today. It was great. So we welcome your questions. If you have anything for Paul, please make sure to leave us a comment. Give us a like if you enjoyed this conversation, and make sure you tune into some future episodes. And I believe we're going to keep the door open for Paul to come back, have one other conversation, because there's more to dig in here, I'm sure, with licensing. So
the tokenization one. Yep. We got to talk about the future.
You know, we almost got through this whole episode without talking about AI. So, because I had to mention it. So anyway, but that's a whole tokenization thing. So anyway, with that, please make time, everybody, to continue to stay sharp. Thanks.
Thanks,
Have a good day.
Bye.
All right, and that's a wrap for today's episode. Thanks to Paul Empringham for a conversation that was way more interesting than software licensing sounds on paper. If anything today made you think twice about your next renewal, that's the point. Make sure you get in touch with Paul. And if you enjoyed this episode, drop us a comment, give us a like, and we certainly hope to see you next time. And don't forget, make sure you make time to stay sharp with us. Thanks, everybody.